don't look down." The scream tore through the 40th floor like a blade through wet paper, ripping across the observation terrace, where the wind had turned violent and mean. A woman in a black dress was sliding past the edge of the railing, her heels scraping uselessly against wet stone, her fingers clawing at nothing. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The handful of executives who had stepped outside for air stood frozen, phones still in their hands, mouths open in silent horror, as if watching a nightmare they could not convince themselves was real. Then a man near the emergency exit door moved before his own mind had finished processing what his eyes had seen. He crossed the distance in a blur, dropped low, and closed one hand around her wrist just as her body left the ledge entirely. For 3 long seconds, the two of them hung suspended above the gray, rain-soaked city, her weight pulling against his shoulder, his boots braced against the metal lip of the terrace. She looked up into his face, terror rewriting every feature of her own, and asked him who he was. He said nothing. He only pulled. When security finally reached the terrace and checked the identification badge clipped to his jacket, the room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. He was not a maintenance contractor. He was not in any file anyone in that building could access, a man who existed at all. 3 minutes later, a name surfaced that had been erased from every public record in the country, attached to a designation that belonged to men the government preferred the world forget. A former Navy SEAL, presumed dead for 8 years, Kellen Rohr was 39 years old, and he had built a life designed to be forgotten. He lived 2 towns outside the city in a small rented house with peeling paint and a porch light that flickered. He drove a truck that had seen better decades and worked freelance technical maintenance contracts in the kind of glass towers where men like him were invisible by design. He never spoke about where he had come from. He never wore anything that cost more than the tools in his bag. He did not raise his voice, did not make eye contact longer than necessary, and had perfected the particular art of walking through a crowded lobby without a single head turning to follow him. To the doormen, the executives, and the cleaning crews who saw him twice a month, he was simply the quiet contractor who fixed what broke and left before anyone remembered his name. Underneath that ordinary surface, though, was a man who had built his entire existence around the same rule his old commanding officer used to drill into him: the moment people notice you, they start asking questions. And questions were the one thing Kellen Rohr could no longer afford to answer. He had a life to protect that had nothing to do with medals or missions, a quiet home where someone depended on him showing up every evening at the same hour. And that alone was reason enough to stay a shadow. The call that brought him to Aurelius Tower that morning was routine, a broken climate control panel on the executive floor, the kind of job that paid well because the client wanted no delays and no questions. The building was hosting a closed-door meeting of the city's most guarded financial minds, and security had been doubled for the occasion. Kellen arrived early, badge checked twice, tools inspected once, and made his way toward the mechanical room without so much as glancing at the glass conference hall where the real business of the day was unfolding. Inside that hall, Serafina Vale sat at the head of a long table, 37 years old and already a legend in rooms that chewed up lesser executives for sport. She was the chief executive of Vale Meridian Holdings, a woman famous for never raising her voice, never blinking first in a negotiation, and never, according to the rumors that followed her through every boardroom in the country, allowing anything resembling emotion to touch her decisions. The meeting had grown tense over a hostile acquisition bid nobody in the room wanted to name directly, voices sharpening, tempers fraying at the edges, until Serafina rose from her chair and told the room she needed a moment of air. Nobody argued with her. Nobody ever did. The terrace door slammed against its frame in the gusting wind as she stepped outside, the cold biting through her blazer, the city spread out gray and indifferent 40 floors below. She walked to the railing to steady her nerves the way she always did, one hand resting against the cold metal, when a hairline crack she never noticed split silently through the reinforced glass barrier beside her. The wind found the weakness and widened it in an instant, the panel giving way beneath her weight as she leaned, and the world tilted sideways so fast that her scream left her throat before her mind understood what was happening. She felt her heels slide, felt the railing vanish from beneath her palm, felt gravity take hold of her the way it takes hold of everything. Somewhere behind her, a man setting down his toolbox in the mechanical corridor heard the sound change, heard the particular pitch of a scream that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong, and moved before conscious thought had caught up with instinct. Kellen Rohr crossed the terrace at a dead run, dropped his weight low the way he had been trained to 1,000 times over on rooftops that had nothing to do with corporate towers, and closed his hand around Serafina's wrist a half-second before she would have been beyond anyone's reach. They hung together over the edge of the building, her body swaying against the wind, his arm locked at an angle that should have dislocated his shoulder and somehow did not. She stared up at him, her face white with terror, and managed to ask him, in a voice barely audible over the wind, whether he wasn't afraid of falling with her. He told her, calm as a man discussing the weather, not to look down. And when she asked again, desperate, whether he felt any fear at all, he answered that he had once stood at heights far worse than this one. It was the first sentence he had spoken to her, and it was already a door left open. A crack onto a past that did not belong to any maintenance contractor she had ever met. He drew her up hand over hand, bracing his boot against the terrace ledge, until her knees found solid concrete again, and she collapsed against the railing, breathing in ragged, disbelieving gulps. Security arrived seconds later in a wave of shouting and radios. As one of the guards reached to steady Kellen, his eyes caught on the worn, matte black watch strapped to the man's wrist. A design the guard recognized from his own years in uniform. He looked up at Kellen's face, then back down at the watch, and said, almost to himself, that it could not possibly be true. Serafina wanted to thank the man who had saved her life properly, the way her position demanded, with cameras and statements and a check large enough to make headlines. Kellen wanted none of it. When she found him afterward in the maintenance corridor, calmly packing his tools as though nothing unusual had happened, he told her only that he had done what anyone would have done in his place. She did not believe that for a second, and something about his refusal to accept even basic gratitude needled at her curiosity more than any grand gesture could have. She asked his name, and he gave it plainly, without title, without company, without the business card that every other man in that building would have produced within seconds of meeting a billionaire. Kellen Rohr, he said. Nothing more. And he turned back to his work as though the conversation were already finished. When her assistant later confirmed that the man held nothing more than a short-term maintenance contract with the building, Serafina offered a reward substantial enough to change most people's lives, and Kellen declined it without hesitation, which unsettled her far more than accepting it ever could have. Serafina Vale had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from her, and she had grown so accustomed to that current running beneath every conversation that its absence felt like standing in a room with the gravity switched off. Kellen did not linger near her. He did not angle for a second meeting. He did not ask about her company. He did not even hold eye contact longer than politeness required. That night, alone in the penthouse she rarely used for anything but sleep, she found herself turning the question over and over: what kind of ordinary man reacts to a stranger falling 40 stories with that kind of instinct, that kind of speed, that kind of terrifying calm? Ordinary men froze. Ordinary men reached for their phones before they reached for a hand. The security footage from the terrace, when she finally watched it in full, showed something that made the analysts in her private security office go quiet as they reviewed it frame by frame. Kellen had not simply run toward her. He had assessed the angle of her fall, calculated the closing distance in the space of a single stride, dropped his center of gravity before contact, and locked his grip on the precise point of her wrist that would bear weight without breaking bone. All while his breathing, visible even through the grainy footage, never once lost its rhythm. One of her security consultants, a grim veteran of 2 decades in close protection work, watched the clip 3 times before turning to Serafina and telling her flatly that what she was looking at was not the reflex of a technician who happened to be nearby. It was the reflex of someone trained to move that way under fire, someone who had drilled that exact sequence of actions until it lived in muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. Serafina said nothing in response, but that night she quietly instructed her head of security to run a full background check on the man named Kellen Rohr, the kind of check reserved for potential threats rather than grateful thank you notes. She told herself it was simple due diligence, the responsible thing for any executive to do after a stranger had gotten close enough to touch her. But some smaller, more honest part of her already suspected the investigation was about something else entirely. The first report landed on her desk less than a day later, and it contained exactly one line, stark against the otherwise empty page: no verifiable employment data existed for the subject across the previous 8 years. It was as if Kellen Rohr had stepped out of nothing to catch her and had almost stepped back into nothing the moment he let go. Serafina brought the strange, empty report to Dorian Mercer, her head of corporate security, a broad-shouldered former federal investigator who had built his career on the simple principle that everyone left a trail somewhere. Dorian took the assignment personally, treating the absence of information as its own kind of clue rather than a dead end, and within 2 days he had assembled a picture stranger than anything either of them had expected. Kellen Rohr had indeed served in the United States military. That much was confirmed by fragments scattered across half a dozen databases that did not like to talk to one another. But the specifics of his service were walled off behind classification markers Dorian had seen only a handful of times in his entire career. Deployment records existed, then abruptly did not. Unit designations appeared for a few years, then vanished behind redaction bars so thick they obscured entire pages. A final operation, whatever it had been, seemed to mark the exact point at which Kellen Rohr effectively ceased to exist on paper, as though someone with considerable authority had gone through his file afterward with the specific intention of making him disappear. The strangest detail of all, Dorian told her, was that portions of the file had not simply been classified. They had been manually deleted, scrubbed by a human hand rather than an automated retention policy, which suggested someone had gone out of their way at some point to erase Kellen Rohr from the official record entirely. Serafina sat with that information for a long time after Dorian left her office, turning it over the way she turned over difficult contract clauses, looking for the angle nobody else had noticed yet. A quieter, more unsettling thought began to take shape behind the obvious one. Perhaps the man who had caught her by the wrist was not a person hiding from his own past at all. Perhaps it was his past that was still out there somewhere, actively hiding from him, waiting for the right moment to surface again. Neither possibility explained why a stranger with a scrubbed military record would risk his life for a woman he had never met, and that unanswered question sat at the center of everything that followed, refusing to resolve itself no matter how long she stared at it. While Serafina turned the mystery of Kellen Rohr over in her mind, a different kind of attention had already begun circling her from another direction entirely, one with far less noble intentions. A small, disciplined group had been tracking her movements for weeks, arriving at her building minutes before she did and leaving only after she had gone, always at a careful distance, always without the telltale eagerness of tabloid photographers hoping for a candid shot. These were not people chasing a story. These were people who already knew her calendar better than her own assistant did, who understood the rhythm of her mornings and the pattern of her security rotations with an intimacy that could only come from months of careful study. At the center of the group stood a man named Maddox Vane, a former private security specialist with a reputation in certain circles for solving problems that polite society preferred not to discuss openly. Currently on retainer for one of Vale Meridian's most aggressive corporate rivals, Vane's employers had grown tired of losing to Serafina in boardrooms and courtrooms alike and had decided, with the cold pragmatism of men who had run out of legal options, that the fastest remaining path to control of her company ran directly through her. It was Kellen, arriving early for another maintenance call 2 days after the terrace incident, who first noticed the sedan parked in a loading zone outside the tower that had no business being there, its engine idling, its windows tinted a shade darker than the building's own security regulations allowed for visitor vehicles. He did not photograph it. He did not report it to the front desk. He simply memorized the plate in the 2 seconds his gaze passed over it, filed it away the way he had once filed away enemy positions on rooftops that had nothing to do with corporate skylines, and continued into the building as though he had noticed nothing at all. Later that afternoon, when Serafina crossed the lobby on her way to a meeting, he fell into step beside her just long enough to tell her quietly that she was being watched. She stopped mid-stride and asked him how he could possibly know that from a glance out a window. He told her, without a trace of drama in his voice, that ordinary people did not park in that particular loading zone at that particular angle with that particular line of sight to her private elevator, and that the difference between an ordinary observation and a professional one was usually a matter of details nobody else bothered to notice. That night, her phone buzzed with a message from a number that traced back to nothing, a single sentence glowing on the screen in the dark of her penthouse: "The man who saved you yesterday will not be there to save you again." Serafina called an emergency shareholder meeting the following week, determined to project stability in the face of a hostile bid that had grown more aggressive by the day, and against the objections of nearly every senior executive in the building. She brought Kellen on as a temporary security consultant. The reaction in the boardroom was immediate and unkind. One director, a silver-haired man who had never once had to fight for anything in his career, looked Kellen up and down and remarked loudly enough for the whole table to hear that the man was nothing more than a building maintenance worker playing dress-up. Kellen did not respond. He did not so much as shift his weight. Serafina, however, met the director's gaze without blinking and told the room, in a voice that closed the subject permanently, that this man had saved her life, and that the conversation about his qualifications was already over. The silence that followed was the kind that settled over rooms only when everyone present understood all at once that they had misjudged something important. Behind the scenes, Maddox Vane had already succeeded in placing an inside contact within Vale Meridian's own security infrastructure, a technician quietly compromised months earlier through debts nobody at the company had bothered to notice. The plan taking shape was elegant in its cruelty. Engineer an accident convincing enough to force Serafina out of active control of her own company, handing the board no choice but to install a more compliant replacement while the acquisition moved forward unopposed. Kellen noticed the irregularities almost immediately, small inconsistencies in access logs and maintenance schedules that would have meant nothing to anyone who had not spent years learning to read patterns for a living. But he said nothing to Dorian's team, not yet. Instead he worked alone, quietly auditing every system that could be turned into a weapon: the cameras, the emergency exits, the elevator controls, the internal communications network that kept the entire building talking to itself. He moved through Aurelius Tower like a man conducting a slow, silent reconnaissance, gathering pieces of a puzzle he had not yet decided to share. The trap sprang 2 days later, when the elevator carrying Serafina between floors shuddered to a violent stop between the 18th and 19th levels, the lights flickering once before settling into a dim emergency glow. She stood alone in the compartment, her phone useless in the dead zone the shaft had somehow developed overnight, listening to a low mechanical groan that sounded less like malfunction and more like something being deliberately manipulated from outside her line of sight. 2 floors above, Kellen heard the sound change through the maintenance channel he had rigged to monitor exactly this kind of anomaly, and he was moving before the alarm even finished its first cycle. He reached the control panel outside the shaft within 90 seconds, working with a precision that left the building's own chief engineer standing speechless a few feet away, bypassing 3 separate failsafes with the kind of economy of motion that came only from having done it before under conditions far less forgiving than a corporate elevator shaft. When the doors finally opened and Serafina stepped out into the corridor, shaken but unharmed, she looked at him for a long moment before asking whether he had done this kind of work before. He told her simply that he had done it many times, and something in the flatness of his voice told her not to ask which kind of work he meant. One member of Dorian's security team, reviewing the footage afterward with the kind of professional curiosity that came from years spent studying tactical response, froze the frame on the exact sequence Kellen had used to override the elevator's emergency lockout. He zoomed in on the small, deliberate pattern the man's fingers had traced across the control panel, a rhythm rather than a random sequence of button presses, and felt a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. He had seen that exact method only once before, years earlier, in a classified briefing on counterterrorism tactics that had since been scrubbed from every training manual he had access to. It belonged to a specialized unit within the Naval Special Warfare community, one of the rare teams whose operational history was considered too sensitive to acknowledge in any official capacity. The kind of unit whose members were trained not just to fight, but to disappear entirely once their work was done. Dorian Mercer kept pulling threads long after most investigators would have declared the file a dead end, and his persistence finally led him to a document buried 3 layers deep in an archive that should never have been searchable at all. It was an old service photograph, grainy and official, of a much younger Kellen Rohr, standing in formation with a group of men whose faces had all been carefully blacked out except his own, as though someone had wanted his identity preserved for a reason nobody had bothered to explain. His rank was redacted. His unit designation was redacted. The details of his final operation were redacted so thoroughly that entire paragraphs had become solid black rectangles, leaving only a single line of text visible at the bottom of the page: operative presumed dead. Dorian read that line 3 times before he set the document down, because if it was accurate, then the man currently walking the halls of Aurelius Tower as a hired security consultant had been officially deceased according to the United States government for the better part of a decade. The truth, when Dorian eventually pieced it together from fragments and careful inference, was darker than a simple case of mistaken records. Kellen had once belonged to an elite naval special warfare team built specifically for hostage rescue and counterterrorism operations, too sensitive for public acknowledgement, the kind of unit that existed in briefings but never in press releases. There had been 6 of them on that final mission, men who had trained together long enough to know each other's breathing patterns in the dark, men whose families back home believed them to be somewhere routine and unremarkable, filing paperwork on a base nobody could name, on what should have been a clean, well-rehearsed extraction. Someone inside their own chain of command had sold their exact position to the people they were sent to stop, a betrayal that turned a textbook operation into an ambush within minutes, the kind of collapse that left no room for the careful planning that had gone into every other part of the mission. Kellen remembered fire and noise and the particular silence that followed both, a silence he had never fully escaped even years later, in quiet houses, in ordinary mornings, in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He survived. The rest of his team did not. And the operation that followed his escape had been quietly buried by people far above his pay grade, its existence denied so completely that even his own name had been sacrificed in the cleanup, folded into a presumed dead designation that made the entire tragedy easier for someone else to file away. He left the service not long after, unwilling to serve under a system that had let something like that happen and then erased it rather than answer for it, and he had spent every year since living exactly the way Aurelius Tower had first known him, quiet, unremarkable, and permanently beneath the surface. Kellen never wanted to be called a hero, and the reason went deeper than simple modesty. He carried the particular corrosive guilt of the man who walks away from a room that everyone else died in, the kind of weight that never fully sets down, no matter how many years pass or how many quiet, ordinary days a person tries to build on top of it. Serafina began to understand, the more time she spent near him, that his silence had never been arrogance or coldness at all. It was simply the only way he had found to carry what he carried without it crushing him completely, a discipline built from necessity rather than temperament. One evening, in the quiet after another long day of threats and half-answers, she finally asked him how many people he had lost that day, the day whatever happened had happened. Kellen did not answer immediately. He stood very still for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone flat and careful in a way she had not heard from him before. "Everyone who had been standing beside him," he said. "Every single one of them." The danger stopped being theoretical 3 nights later, when Serafina was ambushed leaving a private meeting downtown, 2 vehicles boxing in her car with a coordination that told Kellen immediately this was no random robbery. He recognized the formation before the first shout had even finished leaving anyone's mouth, understood in an instant that this was a planned extraction attempt executed by people who had studied her route in advance, and he moved her out of the vehicle and into a half-abandoned office building nearby before her own driver had finished processing what was happening. Their pursuers followed, methodical and unhurried in the way that professionals moved when they were confident of the outcome, and somewhere in the dim, half-lit corridors of that building, the man Serafina had known as a quiet security consultant fell away entirely, replaced by something colder and infinitely more capable. He read the darkness the way other people read a familiar room, tracking the shift in a distant footstep, the change in air pressure as a door opened 2 floors below, the shape of a shadow crossing a window that should have stayed empty. He raised one hand, and Serafina understood without being told that the gesture meant silence, that her survival in the next several minutes depended entirely on trusting a stranger's instincts over her own panic. Somewhere below them, a door groaned open on old hinges, and Kellen pulled Serafina gently backward into a recessed doorway without a single wasted motion, his palm flat against the wall as though he could read the building's pulse through the concrete itself. A flashlight beam swept the stairwell 2 floors down, thin and searching, and then withdrew. Serafina counted her own heartbeats in the silence that followed, certain the sound of them alone would give her away. Beside her, Kellen simply waited, patient in a way that felt almost inhuman, watching the darkness the way other people watched a clock. She noticed, in the strange clarity that fear sometimes produces, that his breathing had actually slowed rather than quickened, that his hands had stopped shaking the moment the danger became real instead of theoretical. Whatever version of Kellen Rohr had spent years hiding behind a maintenance contractor's badge, this was the version underneath it, and watching him move through that darkened corridor, Serafina understood for the first time that she was not looking at a man discovering a hidden skill. She was looking at a man returning, however reluctantly, to the only self he had ever fully trusted. Maddox Vane finally revealed himself at the end of that corridor, stepping into a shaft of gray street light with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he already held every advantage in the room, and told Kellen directly that he knew exactly who he was, using the surname like a weapon. Kellen told him, in a voice that carried no heat at all, that knowing who he was should have told Vane to run. Vane only smiled and said that the betrayal from years ago had never actually ended, that the people who orchestrated it were still active, still patient, and that their current target had shifted from soldiers in a war zone to a woman standing in this building tonight. Vane's next words landed heavier than the threat itself. He told Kellen that Serafina was not, in fact, the final target of everything that had been set in motion. When Kellen asked who was, Vane's smile widened into something almost pitying as he answered simply, Kellen was. The revelation sat between them like a live wire, reframing everything that had happened over the previous week, and Kellen understood in that moment that his return from the dead had never been an accident of bad luck or coincidence at all. Someone had wanted him found. Someone had wanted him drawn out of hiding, and Serafina's near fall from the terrace 40 floors up had been the first domino in a much longer chain someone else had been arranging for a long, long time. The full shape of the conspiracy revealed itself only when Kellen discovered, almost by accident, that Vale Meridian Holdings quietly owned a controlling stake in a technology firm whose core patents traced back to a defense program active during the exact years of his final SEAL deployment. It was the same underlying technology, refined and repackaged for commercial use, that his old team had been sent in to secure before everything fell apart. That single fact explained everything the surface story could not: why a hostile bid for Serafina's company had escalated into physical violence, why professionals with military-grade tactics had been deployed against a corporate executive, and why the people orchestrating it all wanted control of Vale Meridian badly enough to risk exposure. Serafina herself had no idea any of this history existed within her own company's holdings, and when Kellen explained what he had found, she sat in stunned silence, absorbing the fact that her late father had apparently signed a classified agreement decades earlier, tying the family business to a program neither of them had ever been told the full truth about. She had spent her entire career believing she understood every asset Vale Meridian held, every subsidiary buried 3 layers down in the corporate structure, and the discovery that a piece of her own inheritance was tangled up in a defense program that had gotten men killed left her quieter than Kellen had ever seen her. Somewhere in that overlap of old secrets and new danger, Kellen realized that his life and Serafina's had been quietly intersecting for years before they ever met on that terrace, 2 separate threads of the same buried story finally pulled taut. He found himself wondering, not for the first time, whether the fall she had nearly taken that first afternoon had truly been an accident of cracked glass and bad wind at all, or something set in motion far earlier than either of them had understood. The twist that followed struck Kellen harder than anything Maddox Vane had said in that dark corridor. During his final mission, all those years ago, before the betrayal that ended his career and his team's lives, Kellen had personally extracted an intelligence source from hostile territory, a source whose information had ultimately prevented a financial catastrophe that would have destroyed an American company from the inside. He had never learned the source's identity. The mission had been compartmentalized so thoroughly that even the man who saved that source's life walked away without a name to remember. Serafina, working through her father's old private files with trembling hands, produced a document Kellen had never seen before, an authorization form bearing a signature from decades earlier. When she finally passed it across the table to him, Kellen went completely still. He recognized the handwriting immediately, not from any official record, but from memory, from the one name he had spent 8 years trying to forget, the same man Kellen had once believed with absolute certainty had sold his team's position to the people who killed them. If the signature was authentic, then the man Kellen had blamed for the deaths of every friend he lost that day might never have been the traitor at all, or worse, might still be alive somewhere, walking free while Kellen carried the guilt of a betrayal that belonged to someone else entirely. He set the document down carefully on the table, the way a man sets down something he is afraid might shatter, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Serafina watched him, uncertain whether to speak, understanding only that whatever she had just handed him weighed more than any contract her family's company had ever produced. The revelation cracked something open in him that 8 years of silence had never managed to touch, a question he had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself it no longer mattered. It mattered now more than anything, because if he had spent 8 years hating the wrong ghost, then somewhere out there was the right one, still unaccounted for, still capable of doing to someone else's team what had already been done to his. They fled the city that same night, moving through back roads Kellen had memorized years earlier for exactly this kind of emergency, until they reached a safe house tucked into a stretch of quiet countryside where no camera and no informant could easily find them. In the hush of that first night away from the danger closing in around them, they finally allowed themselves a conversation neither had been ready for until now. Serafina admitted, staring into the small fire Kellen had built without a single wasted motion, that she had once assumed he was simply a man who wanted no attention paid to him, nothing more complicated than that. Kellen told her the fuller truth instead, that he had never wanted his past to drag anyone else down into it with him, that the entire architecture of his quiet life had been built to keep exactly this kind of danger away from the people around him. Serafina looked at him for a long moment and said quietly that she had already been pulled into it regardless, whether either of them had wanted that or not. A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable, the particular kind of silence that only exists between two people who have stopped performing for each other. What grew between them in the days that followed was not the lightning strike kind of romance that made for easy headlines, but something slower and more deliberate, trust assembled piece by piece across shared danger rather than declared in a single dramatic moment. Kellen admitted, in the low light of that borrowed house, that some part of him feared loving her precisely because everyone he had ever cared about in his old life had eventually become a target simply for being close to him. Serafina told him he seemed to believe that protecting her meant standing permanently between her body and every bullet that might come for it, and when he asked quietly whether that wasn't exactly what protection meant, she shook her head and told him that sometimes protecting a person meant letting them stand beside you instead of behind you. The words settled into him slowly, reshaping something he had assumed was fixed since the day he buried the last of his team. The fragile peace of that evening shattered when Serafina's phone lit up on the table between them, a live security feed forwarded automatically from her building's emergency protocol, showing armed men moving through the lobby of Vale Meridian's headquarters with the calm efficiency of a takeover already well underway. Somewhere in the city they had just fled, Maddox Vane's people had made their move, and whatever quiet they had briefly found together in that countryside house had just run out of time. Kellen made the decision to return to the city within minutes, and this time there was no pretense left to maintain, no maintenance badge to hide behind, no careful performance of ordinariness for anyone watching. Dorian Mercer met him at a staging point 3 blocks from the tower with what remained of the loyal security team, and when Kellen laid out exactly what needed to happen next, nobody in that room questioned his authority the way the boardroom director had weeks earlier. He told them plainly that no one was going into that building until they understood precisely what they were walking into, and then he began issuing instructions with the calm, absolute clarity of a man who had once been trusted to lead operations that history had chosen to forget. The team around him understood, watching him work, that they were not looking at a hired consultant anymore. They were looking at someone who had once commanded missions so classified that even acknowledging his old rank would have violated half a dozen federal statutes. Inside the tower, Kellen finally came face to face with Maddox Vane on the executive floor where everything had begun weeks earlier. Vane, cornered but still composed, admitted the piece of the story Kellen had suspected but never confirmed. That he had been the communications liaison on that final SEAL mission all those years ago, the man responsible for relaying the team's position to the people who had ambushed them. He had not acted alone, and he was not the architect of the wider betrayal, but he had been the hand that pulled the trigger on the information itself, the single point of failure that had cost Kellen every friend he had standing beside him that day. Kellen absorbed the confession without visible reaction, the years of buried grief and misplaced blame finally resolving into a clearer, colder shape, and understood that the fight unfolding around them now was not only about saving Serafina's company or her life. It was the last unfinished piece of a debt he had been carrying since the day he walked away from a mission everyone else had died in. The confrontation reached its breaking point when Vane, realizing his plan had unraveled beyond salvage, moved to trigger a failsafe that would wipe the servers holding every piece of evidence tying him and his employers to the conspiracy, evidence that would have vanished along with any chance of real justice. Kellen faced an impossible choice in that instant, torn between chasing Vane down before the servers erased everything or staying with Serafina, who stood exposed and unguarded only a few dozen feet away, should anyone else in Vane's crew make a move against her. He did not hesitate for long. He chose Serafina, moving her behind cover and shielding her with his own body until Dorian's team swept the floor and pulled Vane into custody before he ever reached the failsafe switch, the evidence preserved intact for whatever reckoning would follow. In the quiet aftermath, as paramedics and federal agents filled the corridor where the confrontation had ended, Dorian approached Kellen and told him, with something close to reluctance, that everything about to happen next would mean his identity could no longer stay buried, that the story of a man presumed dead resurfacing to stop a corporate conspiracy was not something that could be quietly filed away and forgotten. Kellen looked out over the city through the same glass wall where Serafina had nearly fallen weeks earlier and told Dorian simply that he had spent long enough hiding. Whatever came next, he was finished running from a name the world had once erased on his behalf. The case unraveled quickly once the evidence Kellen had helped protect made its way into federal hands, exposing not just Maddox Vane but the wider network of executives and financiers who had orchestrated the entire attempt to seize control of Vail Meridian Holdings through fear and manufactured accidents. The hostile takeover collapsed within weeks, the company's board unanimously reaffirming Serafina's leadership, and the people who had spent months trying to force her out found themselves facing charges far more serious than any boardroom dispute. Portions of Kellen's military file were quietly restored, not fully, since some secrets remained too sensitive even now for public release, but enough for his service to be formally acknowledged rather than erased, a small and imperfect correction to a debt that could never be fully repaid. A modest ceremony was arranged in the weeks that followed to honor what Kellen had done, though he made it clear beforehand that he had no interest in a long speech or an elaborate spotlight. When the moment came, he kept his words brief, telling the small gathering only that he had not saved a billionaire that day on the terrace. He had saved a person. Serafina, standing near the front of the room, felt those words settle over her differently than any headline ever could have, a reminder that everything Kellen valued lived far below the surface of titles and net worth. Something in Serafina had shifted permanently over the course of those difficult weeks, a quiet recalibration of what she believed actually held value in a life like hers. She had spent years operating on the assumption that power and money could secure almost anything worth having, and had learned, through a man who wanted neither, that certain things simply could not be purchased at any price. Loyalty could not be bought. Sacrifice could not be negotiated into existence. Trust, once broken, could not be rebuilt through any contract her legal team had ever drafted. And love, whatever shape it eventually took, had never once appeared on a balance sheet in her entire career. After the ceremony ended and the small crowd dispersed, Serafina found Kellen standing alone near the exit, still uncomfortable with attention even now, and asked him quietly what he planned to do next now that the danger had finally passed. He told her simply that he planned to live, the way a man speaks when he has spent years merely surviving instead. She asked whether he meant to do that alone, and he looked at her for a long moment before admitting, with the kind of honesty that had defined every conversation between them since the terrace, that he was no longer certain that was true. She smiled at that, a small, unguarded expression that had nothing to do with the composed executive the rest of the world knew, and neither of them reached for anything as dramatic as the kind of kiss that closed out other people's stories. What passed between them instead was quieter than that, and somehow far more certain, two people simply choosing to stand beside each other, without performance, without agenda, without anything left to hide. Weeks later, they returned together to the same terrace on the 40th floor of Aurelius Tower, where everything between them had first begun. The city stretched out below them under a clean winter sky that bore no resemblance to the storm that had nearly taken Serafina's life the first time she stood in that spot. The reinforced glass panel had long since been replaced, the railing reinforced twice over, and yet Kellen still positioned himself a half-step closer to her than strictly necessary, an old habit neither of them felt any need to name out loud. Somewhere behind them, through the tower's windows, the ordinary hum of a Tuesday afternoon continued undisturbed, executives moving between meetings that no longer carried the weight of conspiracy or threat. The building was finally allowed to be nothing more than a building again. She looked out over the skyline for a long moment before asking Kellen, with a small teasing edge in her voice, whether he remembered the very first thing he had ever said to her. He told her he did, and repeated it exactly as he had that day, "Don't look down." Serafina turned to face him then, the wind pulling at her coat the same way it had that first afternoon, and told him that this time she was not afraid at all. Kellen looked at her for a long, quiet moment, the city glittering behind her in the fading light, and told her that neither was he. He thought briefly, and without the old sharp edge of grief, of the men who were not standing on that terrace to see this, and let the thought pass through him the way he had slowly learned to let such thoughts pass, present, but no longer capable of pulling him under. Somewhere far below them, the tower's lights blinked on one by one against the coming darkness, and a man who had spent nearly a decade living like a ghost finally understood that he had found a reason to step fully and permanently back into the light.